Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are opening up a file that, well, honestly, it feels a bit like opening a sealed vault.
A vault that, yeah, maybe some people would prefer stayed shut.
We're going to be talking about the creation of Pakistan, a story that, defines the lives of hundreds of millions of people.
But not the version you read in school.
Yeah.
And definitely not the version you usually hear in the sanitized anniversary speeches.
Definitely not. If you're familiar with the history, or even if you just have the Wikipedia level summary in your head, you know the standard story.
You do.
It goes something like this. The Muslims of India, realizing they were a distinct nation, united as one solid bloc behind the Muslim League. They rallied around their leader, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and together with the blessing of their religious scholars, they created an Islamic state.
Right. A story of cohesion, religious unity against a colonial power.
Simple, clean, inspiring.
That is the official narrative. That is, the statue they built in the town square. But today, we are looking at a source that walks up to that statue and starts taking a sledgehammer to the foundation. We are looking at a transcript of a speech by Allama Ghulam Ahmed Parwez.
And Parwez isn't just some armchair commentator writing from a library 50 years later.
No, not at all.
He was there. He was a civil servant in the government of India during the real heat of the movement. He was a close associate of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the Tolu-e-Islam Azm. And the speech he gives, it's candid. It's almost painful in its honesty.
It was delivered later, around 1977, I believe, but he's looking back specifically at the critical turning points of 1940. And right out of the gate, he establishes what he calls the Great Paradox.
The Great Paradox. Let's dig into that immediately because it really does set the table for everything else we're going to talk about.
The central tension of this entire deep dive is this. If the creation of Pakistan was a religious movement for an Islamic state, why were the most prominent, learned, and respected religious scholars of that time, the nationalist ulema, the absolute giants of Islamic theology in India? Why were they the fiercest opponents of its creation?
That is the question that just stops you in your tracks, isn't it?
It does.
Parwez is saying essentially, look, I was there, I saw who was standing with Jinnah, and more importantly, I saw who was standing against him.
Exactly. And the people standing against him weren't just the British or the Hindus in the Congress Party. They were the very people who claimed to be the guardians of the faith.
So how does he explain this
Right.
huge discrepancy?
Well, to explain it, Parwez introduces a really useful concept. He distinguishes between Shunita history and Dita history.
Shunita and Dita, these are Persian terms, right?
They are. Shunita means that which is heard.
The rumor mill.
Kind of. It refers to rumors, secondhand accounts, the polished narratives that eventually make it into the textbooks. It's the story that gets agreed upon, after the dust settles.
Okay, so what's Dita?
Dita means that which is seen.
Eyewitness.
Eyewitness testimony. The messy, complicated reality that you only know if you were standing in the room.
And Parwez is staking his claim right there. He says, my story is not Shunita, it is Dita. He's telling us, I am not repeating what I heard. I am reporting what I saw.
And what he saw was Jinnah standing almost completely alone.
So, okay, the mission of this deep dive is to unpack that seen history. We want to understand the forces that actually drove Jinnah forces Parwez identifies as Azm or unshakable resolve and Yaqeen or certainty.
Right. We want to peel back the layers of this paradox. And we need to confront the reality of the opposition he faced. Because when you realize that his biggest enemies were within his own community, the story shifts from a political struggle to something, I don't know, almost Shakespearean.
Let's start with the protagonist of this drama then. The man himself, Muhammad Ali Jinnah.
The Tolu-e-Islam.
Parwez gives us this really interesting, very personal glimpse into Jinnah's life, because we usually picture Jinnah in a very specific way.
Oh, yeah. The monocle, the civil row suit, the cigar.
Right, the very formal, distant, British-educated lawyer, the man who speaks in legal briefs and doesn't suffer fools gladly.
And Parvez confirms that image. He doesn't debunk the strictness. He says Jinnah was notoriously rigid about rules and regulations. He lived by the clock.
An appointment was an appointment.
Absolutely. You needed an appointment to see him weeks in advance sometimes. And if you had a 15-minute slot, you got 15 minutes, not 16. If you were late, the meeting was over before it started. He was a man of absolute precision.
Parwez had a golden ticket.
He did. Parwez reveals he had a standing permission, what he calls the no appointment exception. He could visit Jinnah's house whenever the Quaid was free. He could just walk in, and there's no time limit on their conversations.
Which is huge. That's a level of intimacy that very, very few people had with him. So why Parwez? Parwez was a young man, a mid-level civil servant. Jinnah was the titan of Indian politics. What on earth were they talking about that required that kind of open-door access?
Well, that's the thing. They weren't talking about typical politics. They weren't looking at vote counts or, gerrymandering district maps. Parwez says their bond, their entire connection, was the Quran.
The Quran. Now, this is interesting because the herd history, the Shunnite history, often paints Jinnah as very secular, maybe even irreligious. The man who enjoyed a drink and wasn't a practicing Muslim in the traditional sense.
That is the common view. But Parwez challenges that, and he challenges it hard. He says Jinnah had a deep ishq, a passionate, consuming love for the Quran. And when Parwez visited, that's what they discussed. They would sit for hours talking about the interpretation of the Quran and, crucially, how its principles applied to the modern world.
So it wasn't just reciting verses. It was an intellectual wrestling match with the text.
Exactly. They were trying to figure out, how does this ancient text solve the problems of the 20th century? How do you build a modern state on these principles? It's a side of Jinnah, the deep student of the Quran, that often gets glossed over in favor of the constitutional lawyer image. But Parwez argues you can't understand Jinnah's motivation, his azm, without understanding this bond.
It really reframes his internal drive, doesn't it?
Completely.
And Parwez uses this to explain the massive transformation Jinnah went through. Because Jinnah didn't start out as a separatist. He didn't start out wanting Pakistan.
Far from it. This is context we absolutely cannot skip.
Yeah.
Jinnah began his career as a die-hard Indian nationalist. He was a member of the Congress Party long before he was a serious leader of the Muslim League.
Parwez quotes Jinnah's own famous credo from his early days, right?
He does. I am a nationalist first, nationalist second, and nationalist last. That was his mantra.
He wanted a united India.
He strove for Hindu-Muslim unity within one India for decades. He was famously called the ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity by Sarojini Naidu. He truly believed that if they could just work out the constitutional safeguards, they could live together as one nation.
But then came the break point, 1930.
The year of total, crushing disillusionment. Jinnah had spent years of his life trying to negotiate these safeguards. The Nehru Report, the roundtable conferences in London. One by one, he felt his efforts were rejected by the Hindu majority leadership in the Congress.
He felt they weren't negotiating in good faith.
He felt they were not interested in sharing power, they were interested in dominance. He came to believe they just wanted the British to leave so they could take their place.
And his reaction wasn't to fight harder, it was to walk away.
He gave up. He became so convinced that the unity efforts were doomed and that Indian politics was a dead end that he literally packed his bag.
He left the country.
He left India. He bought a house in England, a beautiful one in Hampstead. He set up his law practice at the Privy Council, the highest court of appeal for the British Empire.
Yeah.
He decided to settle there permanently.
Wow.
He told his sister, Fatima, I am done with India. I am done with politics. Let them sort it out amongst themselves.
That is mind-blowing when you really think about it. The father of the nation had actually retired from the whole idea 4 years before the movement really started in earnest. He was living the life of a wealthy British lawyer.
He was. But then comes 1934, the great pivot.
What brought him back?
Parwez credits the poet-philosopher Allama Iqbal for persuading Jinnah to return. Iqbal wrote to him, he met with him in London, and he convinced him that the Muslim masses in India were rudderless, like a ship without a captain.
He basically told Jinnah, you're the only one.
Pretty much. You are the only one who can lead them. If you don't come back, they are lost.
So he comes back. But the Jinnah who stepped off the boot in 1934, he was a different man.
A completely different man. It was a 180-degree ideological shift.
So the old view was what?
The old view was, Indians are one nation, divided by religion but united by geography and culture. The new view was the two-nation theory. He now argued that Muslims are a distinct nation based on Deen, which is more than just faith, it's a whole ideology, a way of life, and that they're completely separate from Hindus.
It wasn't just about how they prayed anymore.
No. It was about law, culture, history, heroes, everything. He now saw two fundamentally different civilizations living side by side.
And this changed his definition of freedom, didn't it? This is a really subtle but important point Parwez makes.
It's fundamental. For the Congress Party and most Hindus, freedom was geographical. It meant one thing: get the British out, lower the Union Jack, raise the Indian flag. Simple.
Independence from colonial rule. The end.
Right. But for the post-1934 Jinnah, Parwez explains, freedom was ideological. He believed that if the British left, but a permanent, unchangeable Hindu majority took over, Muslims would still be slaves.
Slaves is a heavy word.
He meant it in the sense of political and cultural self-determination. In Jinnah's eyes, real freedom meant the liberty to organize your society according to your own values. And for him, that meant according to the principles of the Quran.
So, if you are ruled by a majority that doesn't share those values, and you are always outvoted, you are not free.
You are not free. You are just a subject of a different master. So, independence from the British wasn't enough. He needed independence from the Hindu majority, too.
So he comes back to India, fired up with this new radical vision. He's ready to fight for a separate Muslim identity, a separate nation. And logic would dictate that the religious leaders of the time, the mullahs, the ulema, the people whose job it was to uphold Islam, would be thrilled.
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
You'd expect them to say, finally, a leader talking about creating a homeland for Islam.
You would expect that. But this brings us to the real meat of Parwez's speech. Section 2, the opposition. And this is where the account gets really, really spicy.
I can imagine.
Parwez paints a picture of Jinnah standing, tanha, solitary, alone against these massive, crushing forces. The British Empire, obviously. The Hindu leadership in Congress, naturally. But the most painful, most vicious opposition, he says, came from the Muslim religious establishment.
Let's name names. Who are we talking about here? Are these just fringe figures or?
No, not at all. We're talking about the nationalist ulema, the heavyweights, Maulana Hussain Ahmad Madani, Mufti Kifayatullah, the leaders of the Majlis-e party. These were the celebrities of the Islamic scholarly world in India. These were the men who led the Friday prayers at the biggest mosques in Delhi and Deoband. Their word was law for millions.
And they didn't just ignore Jinnah, they actively fought him. The 1937 election seemed to be the real turning point in this relationship.
Yes, 1937 was a crucial year. The British had introduced some provincial autonomy, and elections were being held. Jinnah, trying to get the Muslim League organized, formed a parliamentary board to contest the elections under one banner. And he invited these scholars, Madani, the Ahrar leaders, to join him. He wanted a united front.
He reached out a hand.
He did. He said, let's work together. But then the money issue came up. And this is where the story gets pretty gritty.
Okay, tell me the money story.
Parwez writes that the Muslim League treasury at that time was, well, it was empty, literally empty. He says they didn't even have 50 paisa to their name.
That can't be literally true.
It's a bit of hyperbole, but the point is, the party was broke. Jinnah was personally wealthy, but he wasn't going to bankroll the entire party out of his own pocket.
So what did he tell these leaders?
He told them, we have to run on moral credit. We have no money right now. We need your support based on the cause, not on cash.
And how did the holy men react to being told they had to run on moral credit?
They deserted him, almost to a man.
Well,
Parwez specifically mentions the Ahrar party. Now, at the time, there was a rumor circulating, fake news, really, spread by Jinnah's opponents, that Jinnah had brought millions of rupees from the rich Muslim businessmen in Bombay.
so they thought he was holding out on them. They thought he was sitting on a pile of cash.
Exactly. The Ahrar leaders went to Jinnah and demanded 100,000 rupees. Now, you have to understand, 100,000 rupees in 1937 is an absolute fortune. That's funding a small war kind of money.
A king's ransom. And Jinnah.
Jinnah refused. He said, I don't have it. And being Jinnah, he probably added something like, and even if I did, I wouldn't buy your support. He was notoriously allergic to corruption and bribery.
So when the money wasn't there, they turned against him.
They turned with a vengeance. Parwez shares this one anecdote about 500 rupees that really captures the attitude. The Muslim League, trying to be disciplined, asked potential candidates to deposit just 500 rupees to prove they were serious about running.
Just a security deposit, a standard practice.
Right, and Parwez recounts an Ahrar leader mocking this publicly from a stage. He stood up and said, they want 500 rupees. For 500 rupees, we could win an election and get married.
Wow, it just shows the level of, well, it's not about ideology, is it? It's about politics as a business.
It was completely transactional for them. But when the transaction failed, it got ugly. Very ugly. Once these scholars realized Jinnah wouldn't pay, they joined forces with the Congress Party. And once they were on the other side, they launched what Parwez calls a war of fatwas against Jinnah.
Fatwas, religious edicts.
Vicious ones. Parwez says they labeled the Tolu-e-Islam, Azm, the great leader, as Kafir Azam, the great infidel.
That is intense. That's not just political mudslinging, that's spiritual warfare. You're damning a man's soul.
It is. They declared that joining the Muslim League was kufr, an act of disbelief that takes you outside of Islam. They attacked his personal life. They spread propaganda that he had married a Parsi woman.
Which was technically true, right? Ruddy Jinnah was born into a Parsi family.
She was, but, and this is the key part, she converted to Islam before the marriage. The ulema knew this perfectly well, but they conveniently ignored it. They wanted to paint him as an outsider, a westernized, non-Muslim interloper who was leading the faithful astray.
Parwez actually reads a specific fatwa from the Barelvi school of thought in his speech. I want to dwell on this because the language is just terrifying.
He does, and the text he quotes is chilling. It declares Jinnah an apostate, a murtad. Now, in traditional Islamic law, the penalty for apostasy is death.
So they were effectively putting a target on his back.
Absolutely. But the fatwa goes a step further. It adds a clause that is just pure psychological warfare. It says, anyone who even doubts his infidelity is also an infidel.
Wait a minute. So if you're a regular person, a shopkeeper or a farmer, and you just say, hey, maybe Jinnah isn't that bad, maybe he has a point, you are automatically excommunicated.
Exactly. It's a total spiritual blockade. It's designed to shut down critical thinking. If you doubt the fatwa, you are guilty yourself. Imagine the courage it took for a common Muslim to go and vote for the Muslim League when their local imam was telling them from the pulpit that it was a sin equal to idol worship.
It makes Jinnah's eventual success seem almost miraculous. He wasn't just fighting the colonial administration and the Congress, he was fighting the pulpits in every village.
And Jinnah's reaction to all this? Parwez says he remained incredibly calm. He didn't engage in a war of fatwas himself. He just calmly pointed out the hypocrisy.
What hypocrisy?
He noted that these same mullahs had issued fatwas of non-cooperation against the British just a few years earlier, saying it was a sin to participate in their government. Then, when it suited their political alliances with Congress, they declared it was perfectly permissible to enter British councils. He saw them as political opportunists, not men of principle.
But it wasn't just the traditional rural mullahs, was it? There was also a more sophisticated, intellectual opposition. And this is where we have to talk about Maulana Maududi and the Jamaat Islami.
This is a critical part of the deep dive, because Maududi wasn't just a village cleric. He was a writer, a philosopher, a systematic thinker. His influence was huge, and his opposition was purely ideological. Parwez details Maududi's arguments, and they are shocking given how history played out.
Parwez mentions the zoo analogy. This is, I mean, it's a visceral image.
It is. Maududi argued that you cannot build an Islamic state with the Muslims of India as they were. He looked at the Muslim population, the very masses Jinnah was trying to mobilize, and he didn't see a nation. He called it a zoo, Shidiagar.
A zoo? That's incredibly dehumanizing.
He said it contained all types of characters, vultures, crows, partridges, bats. He meant that the moral character of the Muslims was so degraded, so un-Islamic in his view, that they were just a random, chaotic collection of animals with no unifying Islamic spirit.
And his argument was essentially, you can't build a pure building on a rotten foundation.
Precisely. Maududi wrote that even if Jinnah managed to get a state, it would be a kafirana hukumat, a disbelieving government run by infidels. He explicitly stated that the idea of taking a secular, nationalist Muslim state and then trying to turn it into an Islamic one later was impossible.
He called it a miracle he didn't believe could happen.
He did. So his argument was that you needed the moral revolution to happen before the political revolution. You had to create perfect Muslims first, and only then could you have a perfect Islamic state.
But Jinnah's view must have been that if they waited for moral perfection, they would be waiting forever.
Exactly. And in the meantime, the British would hand over power to the Congress, and the political fate of Muslims would be sealed for good. It was a race against time.
And here's the irony that Parwez hammers home. It's almost the climax of his critique, the part where you can really feel his anger.
It is the ultimate irony. Parwez highlights that these very groups, the RR, the nationalist ulema, Maududi's Jamaat Islami, the ones who called Jinnah Kafir-e Azam, who called the idea of Pakistan a sin, who called the people a zoo. What did they all do after August 1947?
They moved.
They packed their bags and migrated to Pakistan, the very state they said was un-Islamic and shouldn't exist.
Yeah.
And once they arrived, they didn't say, you know what, we were wrong, sorry about that. No. They said, move over. We are the true custodians of Islam. We will tell you how to run this country you created against our wishes.
They co-opted the victory. They took over the project they tried to sabotage.
They did. Parwez argues that they claimed the right to define the country's ideology. They became the self-appointed guardians of the theocracy that Jinnah never wanted. Parwez was so bitter about this. You can hear it in the text. He's saying, you fought it, you called it kufr, and now you want to own it.
It really reframes the whole struggle, doesn't it? It wasn't just Muslims versus British or Muslims versus Hindus. It was a civil war of ideas within the Muslim community itself.
And that struggle comes to a head on one specific date, March 23, 1940, the Day of Resolve.
This is the day the Lahore Resolution, what later became known as the Pakistan Resolution, was passed. Now, usually when we see footage of this day, it looks like a celebration. You see those grainy black and white films, huge crowds cheering. But Parwez paints a scene of absolute terror.
It was not a celebration. It was a siege. Just 4 days before, on March 19th, there had been a massacre in Lahore. The police had opened fire on the Khaksars, a paramilitary Muslim group.
People were killed.
Many were killed. The city was under a strict curfew. Parwez calls it a matam khada, a house of mourning. People were terrified. The streets were empty.
And there were active attempts to stop the Muslim League meeting.
Oh, yes. The unionist leaders in Punjab, people like Sir Sikandar Hayat Khan, who were technically allies of the Muslim League, but were also part of the ruling establishment, they tried to sabotage the session. They used the unrest as an excuse. They said, it's too dangerous, cancel it, postpone it. They wanted it to fail.
And Jinnah was in Delhi at this time.
I was in Delhi. And Parwez recounts being there at Jinnah's house on Aurangzeb Road when the phone call came. Jinnah was warned by everyone. Do not come to Lahore. It's a war zone. You might be arrested at the station. You might be killed.
In Jinnah's response, this is one of those cinematic moments.
It is. Parwez says Jinnah held the phone and in his calm, clipped voice said, the meeting will happen as scheduled. If I am handcuffed at Lahore station, I will wear them. But I am coming.
That is the Azm, the unshakable resolve.
That is the Azm. He gets on the train. He arrives in Lahore, and the first thing he does, he goes straight to the hospital to visit the injured Khaksars. That one gesture, it broke the psychological siege of the city. The people saw him, and they realized he is not afraid. And because he wasn't afraid, they stopped being afraid. Despite the curfew, despite the fear, the city poured out to see him.
Parwez describes the scene at Minto Park, which is now where the Minari Pakistan stands. He says Jinnah got on stage and spoke for 2 or 3 hours in English.
This is a fascinating detail about communication. The crowd was massive, over 100,000 people. Parwez estimates that 90%, maybe more, of them did not speak a word of English. They were Punjabi peasants, workers, shopkeepers. And Jinnah only spoke English. His Urdu was not good enough for a major political address.
So you have a guy in a suit speaking a foreign language for 3 hours to a crowd that can't understand him. By all the laws of public speaking, that should have been a disaster. The crowd should have gotten bored, walked away, or started chatting among themselves.
Parwez says there was pin-drop silence. He calls it Ser magic. He says the crowd sat there completely mesmerized. They weren't listening to the words, they were watching the character. They were watching the integrity of the man on that stage. They knew intuitively this man is fighting for us, even if they couldn't understand the specific legal arguments he was making about federalism and autonomy.
That is powerful. It transcends language. It's about trust, pure and simple.
It is. And when the resolution passed, the backlash was immediate and ferocious. Gandhi called it a path of kufr and a sin. And of course, the Muslim opponents, the nationalist ulema, they echoed him. But the die was cast. The resolve had been set in stone.
So they passed the resolution. They have the goal. But what was the vision? This is the part that I think gets debated the most today. Was Jinnah trying to create a theocracy, a secular state, a socialist state? What does Parwez say, based on his own conversations with the man?
Parwez is very specific here. He outlines 3 pillars of what Pakistan was not meant to be, based on his direct interactions with Jinnah and his analysis of Jinnah's speeches.
All right, let's go through the negatives. Pillar number 1.
It was not going to be a theocracy. Jinnah explicitly stated, repeatedly, that there would be no priestcraft in Pakistan. He said the state would not be run by mullahs. I mean, he had just spent years fighting the ulema. He certainly wasn't about to hand the country over to them.
That seems pretty clear.
Pillar number 2.
It was not going to be a capitalist state. This is often overlooked. Jinnah gave speeches where he warned the landlords and the capitalists. He called the Western capitalist system vicious and said it had failed to solve humanity's problems. He told them that Pakistan was not going to be a playground for their exploitation. He wanted economic justice. Okay, and pillar number 3.
It was not going to be a simple copy of Western democracy.
Wait, really? I thought Jinnah was a constitutionalist through and through. He was a British-trained lawyer. That seems counterintuitive.
He is a constitutionalist.
Yeah.
But Parwez makes a nuanced point here. Jinnah didn't want a carbon copy of the British parliamentary system, because he realized that the first past the post pure majority rule system works, more or less, in a place like Britain because of its cultural homogeneity. In a place like India, or even Pakistan with its diverse ethnic groups, pure majority rule could just mean the permanent tyranny of the majority over minorities.
So if it's not theocracy, not capitalism, and not a carbon copy of Western democracy, what is it? What's left?
Parwez says Jinnah wanted a state based on Quranic rule.
Okay, let's pause right there. How is Quranic rule different from theocracy? To a lot of people, that sounds like a contradiction. If you base the state on the Quran, aren't you by definition inviting the mullahs in to interpret it?
This is the crucial distinction in Parwez's thought, and he argues in Jinnah's thought. For them, theocracy meant the rule of the clergy, a class of priests or mullahs who act as intermediaries between God and man, and who enforce their interpretation on everyone else.
The rule of men in God's name.
Exactly. Quranic rule, in their view, was different. It meant a state where the principles of the Quran, justice, equity, freedom, compassion, fair play, are the supreme law of the land, but without a priestly class mediating it.
So the idea is that the Quran sets the boundaries. It's like the moral constitution. And within those boundaries, the people, through their elected representatives, are free to govern themselves and legislate for their time.
That's it, exactly. Parwez says Jinnah believed the Quran provides the limits of freedom: don't exploit, don't hoard, don't oppress, ensure everyone is cared for, and within those unchangeable limits, the state is free to legislate. It doesn't need a mullah to sign off on every piece of legislation. It's a vision of a dynamic Islam that evolves with the times versus a static, ritualistic Islam that is frozen in the past.
That's a fascinating distinction. God's law without the middleman.
Precisely.
But amidst all this philosophy and this intense political battling, there was a ticking clock, a physical, biological ticking clock that almost no one knew about. And this brings us to what Parwez calls the X-ray secret.
This part of the story plays out like a thriller, but a really tragic one. Parwez reveals a secret that was known only to Jinnah and his Parsi doctor in Bombay, Dr. Patel.
And this was years before 1947.
Yes, a few years before. Jinnah had been feeling weak, losing weight, had this persistent cough. He finally went for a checkup. The doctor took x-rays of his lungs.
And the results?
The results were devastating. His lungs were, in the doctor's words, being destroyed. It was likely advanced tuberculosis, possibly complicated by lung cancer.
And the doctor gave him a timeline, a prognosis.
He told him bluntly, "Mr. Jinnah, you have 1 year to live, maybe 2 at the absolute most, but only if you stop everything. You need to go to a hill station, rest completely, stop working, stop stressing. If you keep working at this pace, you will die much, much sooner."
Most people would hear that and, pack it in, spend the last year with family, write their memoirs.
Jinnah didn't. Parwez recounts Jinnah's words to the doctor. He said, "Lock these x-rays in your cabinet. Give me the key. No one must know about this."
Why the secrecy? Why not tell his lieutenants, "Hey guys, I'm sick, we need to speed this up"? It might have even galvanized them.
Because of the strategic necessity. Parwez quotes Lord Mountbatten, the last viceroy of India, the man who partitioned the country. Years later, after everything was over, Mountbatten admitted that if they had known Jinnah was dying, they would have just delayed independence.
They would have waited him out.
Exactly. Mountbatten said something like, "We would have stalled for another year or two. We would have just kept talking, negotiating. Jinnah would have died. And without Jinnah, the Muslim League would have collapsed into infighting. There was no clear number 2 who could hold it all together. There would be no Pakistan."
So Jinnah was literally playing poker with the British Empire, and his bluff was his own life expectancy.
And he won the hand, but he paid for it with his life. Parwez uses the English phrase willpower in the speech. He says Jinnah ran on sheer Azm. He ignored the pain. He ignored the fever. He arrived in Pakistan in 1947, a dying man, and had to deal with millions of refugees flooding in, no money in the treasury, no organized army, an Indian threat on the border, all while his lungs were basically gone.
It adds such a tragic, heroic dimension to the story. He gave his life, quite literally, to force this nation into existence and hold it together in its first year.
And that leads us to the final tragedy of the ending, Section 7 of our deep dive, the warning.
Parwez gave this speech in the late 70s, so he's looking around at the Pakistan of his time. Jinnah is long gone, the early leaders are gone, and Parwez is not happy with what he sees.
He is heartbroken. He says the betrayal of the vision is complete. The very theocracy Jinnah fought against The mullahism, as he calls it, has taken over the state's ideology. The state has been hijacked by the ideological descendants of the very people who called Jinnah Kafiri Azam.
He talks about the youth, right? And this part of his speech feels very, very relevant even today.
Eerily relevant. He observes that the educated youth are turning away from religion in droves. They look at the mullah's Islam being presented to them, and they find it irrational. They see it full of contradictions, bizarre fatwas, and sectarian hate. They see a religion that obsesses over the length of a beard, but says nothing about economic justice or feeding the poor, so they reject it entirely.
And where are they going? What's filling that void?
Well, in the 70s, during the Cold War, Parwez noted they were turning to the Red Storm.
Communism.
Yes, he uses this poetic phrase, the threat from Samarkand. It's a historical reference. Samarkand was the route of the Mongol invasions, Halaku Khan, Genghis Khan, who came from the north and destroyed the intellectual centers of the Muslim world like Baghdad.
So in his modern context, Samarkand represents the Soviet Union, communism.
Right. And he asks, why communism? Why is it so attractive to them? Because, Parwez notes, communism at least promises bread. It promises social justice. It promises to feed the hungry and clothe the poor. The religious system being offered to them, in his view, offers neither reason for the mind nor food for the stomach.
So his warning is, if you don't restore the rational, progressive, Quranic vision of Jinnah, a vision that includes social and economic justice, the vacuum will be filled by godless, materialist ideologies.
Exactly. He fears the youth will revolt. He fears the country could fall to external ideologies because the internal ideology, the corrupted, ritualistic version of religion, has failed to answer their questions or solve their problems.
It's a very heavy warning. It's a plea, really.
It is. Parwez ends by saying he isn't hopeless because he's a student of the Quran and ultimately believes in the triumph of truth. But he is deeply, deeply anxious. He sees a nation that has the name Pakistan, but has lost the soul that was intended for it.
So let's try and summarize this. We've gone from a solitary lawyer with a secret death sentence, fighting against the British, the Hindus, and his own religious leaders,
To the creation of a state against all odds, driven by his sheer force of will.
to the eventual takeover of that state's ideology by the very people who opposed its creation.
That is the arc Parwez draws. It's a tragedy in 3 acts: resolve, creation, and betrayal.
It really forces you to ask, what is history? Is it what happened? Or is it what we are told happened, the Dida versus the Shunita?
Parwez would say true history is Dida, what was seen, but we usually only get the Shunita, what is heard. And the people who shout the loudest, or who control the pulpits in the classrooms, often control what is heard.
The people who write the textbooks.
Precisely. And in this case, the supreme irony is that the villains of 1940 in Parwez's narrative became the heroes of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. They rewrote the narrative to say, we were always with you. This was always a religious project meant for us to rule. And Jinnah's specific, nuanced vision, not theocracy, not capitalism, but something new, got lost in the noise.
It makes you wonder about the country today. If the founder explicitly rejected theocracy and capitalism, but the nation ended up embracing both in many ways.
Then you have to ask the hard question. Is the country existing today actually the one that was imagined in 1940? Or is it something else entirely, just wearing the same name tag?
That is a provocative thought, and maybe that's the whole point of this deep dive. To look past the labels, past the statues, and see the original blueprint. To understand that the history of Pakistan is far more contested, far more complex, and far more interesting than the simple story of Muslims versus Hindus.
And to recognize the cost, the sheer human will, the adazm it took to even draw that blueprint, and the profound tragedy of losing it.
Absolutely. This has been a real eye-opener. It challenges a lot of core assumptions.
It does. And that's why sources like this, primary, candid, unwritten history, are so valuable. They remind us that history is messy, it's personal, and it's often very, very different from the official story we're told.
Well, on that note, we're going to leave you to mull over that paradox, the great paradox of Pakistan. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
See you next time.